The Association of the U.S. Army is pleased to welcome you to AUSA's Thought Leaders Webinar Series, a new webinar series featuring military leaders and contemporary military authors. Kicking off today's webinar is AUSA's Vice President of Education, Lieutenant General Guy Swan.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Association of the United States Army's Thought Leaders Webinar. We want to thank you for joining us today, and while we wish we could all be together here at AUSA, that's not currently possible under the current circumstances. So what we've done is crafted a series of events to bring you senior Army leaders, authors, and other personalities speaking on topics of current interest to America's Army, all in a live interactive forum. And we're very glad you've joined us today, and we appreciate your support as partners in defense of our nation. I especially want to welcome the veterans of the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. We thank you for your service, both in Vietnam and afterwards, and service to the Army and to our nation. So thanks for joining us. Today we have a special guest speaker, Don Snedeker, author of the recently published book, The Blackhorse in Vietnam, the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Vietnam and Cambodia from 1966 to 1972. Don is a second-generation Blackhorse trooper. His father, George Snedeker, served in the 11th Cavalry twice, once on horseback and once on tanks. Don was commissioned in the armor branch out of ROTC in February of 1969. He arrived in Vietnam in late '69 and was briefly assigned to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment. He served most of his Vietnam tour with the 2nd Squadron, 1st Armored Cavalry Regiment, serving as an Armored Cavalry platoon leader and long-range reconnaissance patrol platoon leader. In December 1974, Don was assigned to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment in Fulda, Germany, where he served as the regimental training officer, 1st Squadron intelligence officer, and commander of Bravo Troop. From 1989 to 1990, Don served as a speechwriter for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, then Admiral William Crowe, and then General Colin Powell. Don retired from active military service in 1992, and for the past 20 years, Don has served as the historian for the 11th Armored Cavalry Veterans of Vietnam and Cambodia. Don, we want to thank you for being here and presenting this book. For those who are joining us online, please take advantage of having Don here to ask your questions. You can use the Q&A tab on the right side of your screen to submit a question. And after Don talks to us about the book, we'll take as many questions as time will allow. Before I turn the floor over to Don, I did want to read a brief excerpt from the book that kind of encapsulates what the regiment did in Vietnam, if you would bear with me for just a minute. Beginning in 1968, "Find the bastards and pile on" was the regiment's motto, and the tactic was a wholly Blackhorse design. It meant sending ground and aerial scouts out to locate enemy forces, and once found, to reinforce with as many forces as possible, ground and air, and firepower, artillery, gunships, and bombers as quickly as possible. It wasn't until after Tet 68 that the regiment could begin to employ with devastating effectiveness the tactics of find the bastards and pile on. It was only at this point that the Blackhorse wrested the initiative from the enemy on a wide scale, leaving security of base camps more and more frequently to less mobile forces. It was only at this point, midway through the Vietnam War and a full year and a half after the regiment arrived in country, that General Abrams and his staff gave the green light to Colonels Patton, Starry, Leach, Garrity, and Nutting, actually enabling the Blackhorse to work its magic. Working in tandem with, rather than in support of, the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions, and especially the 1st Cavalry Division, the regiment moved north to and eventually across the Cambodian border, finding the bastards, piling on, sending them packing, minus large numbers of their comrades, tons of rice, hundreds of weapons, and most importantly, the battlefield initiative. With that, let me turn the floor over to our author today, Don Snedeker. Welcome, Don.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Don Snedeker, and I am a Blackhorse trooper. I am the author of The Blackhorse in Vietnam. It's taken me 25 years to write this book. I've conducted hundreds of interviews with veterans and their families. And all of this work has led me to the following conclusion. Next slide, please. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment was the most lethal brigade-sized unit in Vietnam. The regiment could go looking for trouble, and when it found that trouble, they could take care of business with their own assets. Blackhorse 6, the regimental commander, generally didn't have to call on some other unit like aviation or artillery or engineers to take care of business. This is not just a boast. This book proves it. Next slide, please. This was the regiment's motto: find the bastards and then pile on. Equipment and organization were a big part of the regiment's success in implementing this tactic. But the 25,000 plus troopers who served in this regiment in its 6.5 years in combat were the real reason for that success. Next slide, please. Over the course of those 6.5 years, the regiment faced a number of challenges. This book tells about each of these things and how they contributed to the Blackhorse being the most lethal brigade-sized unit in Vietnam. Next slide, please. The enemy, weather, and terrain were common challenges to all of the units in Vietnam. But there were several unique aspects to those challenges that complicated life for Blackhorse troopers. And the last two challenges, doctrine, the lack of doctrine, and an internal Army bias that a counterinsurgency was an infantryman's war. And what are these cavalrymen wanting to do here? Made things especially difficult. Next slide, please. At first, the enemy in Hanoi wasn't sure how to deal with the 11th Cav's 400 plus armored vehicles and almost 50 helicopters. They eventually settled on a combination of rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, and anti-tank mines supplied in the hundreds of thousands by the Soviet Union and Communist China to counter this armored might. This book tells how the Blackhorse troopers overcame these threats. This slide shows a sign put up by members of F Troop 2nd Squadron on a temporary fire base near the Cambodian border in late 1969. Named after the then popular TV show F Troop, Fort Courage interdicted the enemy's attempt to infiltrate men and supplies from Cambodia into Vietnam. An entire North Vietnamese regiment attempted to kick F Troop out of Fort Courage. They failed. They did leave behind, however, the sign with an RPG hole in it, shown on the right side of the slide. Next slide, please. Overcoming the enemy threats was not without cost. 730 Blackhorse troopers lost their lives in the Vietnam War. 730. Next slide, please. But the armored protection offered by their vehicles saved troopers' lives and allowed the rest of the unit time to gain fire superiority and win on the battlefield. Next slide, please. The Army's experience in World War II in the Pacific, as well as France's experience in Indochina against the Viet Minh after the war, convinced most that South Vietnam was simply not tank country. Even the armor school was convinced, and this slide shows a quotation from an armor school study from early 60s, saying it's not tank country. But the outstanding achievements of armored cavalry troopers of the quarter horse and the three-quarter horse in 1966 convinced the Army Chief of Staff to deploy the Blackhorse to Vietnam despite the common wisdom. Next slide, please. Blackhorse troopers faced two significant weather and terrain challenges. First, the thick jungle and water-filled rice paddies had sometimes debilitating effects on cross-country mobility. Second, unlike most units in Vietnam, the regiment did not have its own permanently assigned area of operations. All of the infantry divisions did, the regiment didn't. So just as troopers were getting used to the terrain, the enemy in a particular area of operations, the headquarters said, okay, go north, go west, go someplace else. They need help there. The story, for example, is of 3rd Squadron that operated in Hao Nia province, northwest of Saigon, just after Tet 68. And they thwarted the 9th VC Division's attempts to go back to Saigon. 3 months later, the 1st Squadron went back to that same area and fought that same division and again stopped them from attacking Saigon. But the dry rice paddies that the 3rd Squadron had been working on were now morasses of mud. And the 1st Squadron had a very difficult time, but they succeeded. Both squadrons overcame the weather and the terrain, defeated the 9th VC Division, and they were both awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for their actions in 1968. Next slide, please. Everyone who served in Vietnam can relate to this picture of the South Vietnamese soldiers fighting General Mud. I've been there. A lot of you who are listening today have as well. Next slide, please. But the mud had a special, it made life especially miserable for Blackhorse troopers. It made driving a vehicle a real challenge. If you look on the slide in the center, that's a ACAV, Armored Cavalry Assault Vehicle, in a fire base. And that soup, that thick pea soup that wasn't very tasty, I suspect, is them trying to get out of that fire base. And you can see what effect the mud had on vehicular operations. Next slide, please. In the dry season, the dust got into everything. It got onto your skin. You came back from Vietnam, and a month later, you were still washing off Quan Loy dust. It got into the air filters. It got into the oil. It got into the fuel. It got into your food. It got into everything, the aviation gearboxes, everything. But then in the rainy season, there wasn't any dust. There was mud. And it had also very disturbing effects. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand part of this slide, you will see a 1st Squadron tank in Cambodia stuck in the mud. And that changed that crew's plans for the day. In fact, it changed their plans for the next 2 days as well. Next slide, please. As described in this book, the 11th Cavalry became the Army's fire brigade in the area surrounding Saigon. While the US and South Vietnamese divisions all had fixed areas of responsibility shown by their patches on this map, the regiment moved around a lot. If you look at the right-hand side, bottom right-hand side of the map, you'll see the Blackhorse patch. That's where the regiment started out in the first part of '69. And over the course of that year, the regiment moved to the west, to the north, and ended up in December all the way up near the Cambodian border, over 100 kilometers away. The terrain was different. The enemy was different. It was a tough challenge. But as this book shows, the regiment overcame that challenge, and the Blackhorse troopers were the reason. Next slide, please. The next challenge was the lack of doctrine. The armor school had problems shifting its focus from the plains of northern Germany to the jungles of Southeast Asia. But when they got around to doing that, it was based on the accomplishments of the 11th Cavalry, the quarter horse, the 3/4 horse, the 3rd of the 5th Cav of the 9th Infantry. It was based on their actions that the armor school finally developed some doctrine. And it started out in 1966 when Colonel Cobb said to the members of his regiment before deploying to Vietnam, "We're making our own doctrine here, guys. Everybody has to contribute." And one of the contributions came from an M Company platoon sergeant who had served in World War II and had some really good ideas about how to operate with tanks in a jungle. And one of them came from the 2nd Squadron commander, who had just come back from a tour of duty as an advisor to a South Vietnamese armored unit. So they absolutely contributed to the development of doctrine. They developed anti-ambush drills with the herringbone formation, busting jungle with the jungle box formation, and finding the bastards with the Aero Scout, Armored Scout team. And then piling on with a wide range of power and firepower that was available to the regimental commander. Next slide, please. Tactical doctrine was adapted to the enemy terrain and weather in Vietnam. Some of the lessons learned came at a high cost. For example, the first ambush that the regiment was involved in on the 21st of November, 1966, there were no tanks in the convoy escort. And the lesson learned from that ambush was, even though it was tough on the tanks to be part of a convoy escort, their firepower and armored protection was essential to survival. And so just 20 days later, there was a tank involved in the 2 December 66 ambush, and it made all the difference in the world. And from then on, tanks were part of the convoy escorts. All of these stories are told in this book. Next slide, please. But the biggest challenge that the regiment faced in Vietnam, that all cavalrymen faced in Vietnam, was an Army institutional bias against armored forces. It's a guerrilla war. It's an infantryman's war. That was the common wisdom. Armor, okay, you can guard the base camps, you can escort the convoys, but don't get off the roads. Don't go out into the jungle. You're going to sink in the rice paddies. You're going to bog down. Over the course of time, the regiment proved that this was not right, that the armored vehicles could operate in that environment. And the change was noticeable within the higher command structure, starting with the regiment's ride to the rescue of Bien Hoa and Long Binh in Tet of 68. When nobody else had the mobility to be able to do that, the regiment did the job and saved the day. And from that point forward, everybody wanted a piece of the Blackhorse. All of the division commanders were saying, "Give me a squadron." And so from that point forward, the Blackhorse started to make the reputation that is still part of its heritage today. In 1969, Blackhorse troopers, along with infantry from those divisions, cordoned and cleared enemy villages, They found jungle-based camps and emptied supply caches and wrested the operational initiative from the enemy. And then charging into Cambodia in 1970 and rendering 2 enemy divisions combat ineffective, the regiment established the criteria for battlefield victory. It was within reach. Next slide, please. The 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment overcame all of these challenges and set an enviable record on the battlefield of Vietnam and Cambodia. And this book, The Blackhorse in Vietnam, explains how all of these things happened. Next slide, please. The combination of a robust organization, awesome equipment, strong leadership, and exceptional esprit de corps made the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment the most lethal brigade size unit in Vietnam. There was, however, one other factor, and that is that the regiment was the only armored cavalry regiment, only cavalry regiment in Vietnam as an organic regiment. While some other regimental size headquarters, such as the 173rd Airborne and the Light Infantry Brigades, the separate brigades, they served there as well as brigade size units, but none of them had the unbroken heritage of a cavalry regiment. All of the units that worked for Blackhorse 6 worked for the same commander. They all wore the same patch. They all had the same crest. He had all of the assets under his command that he needed to accomplish any mission assigned. The following slides illustrate that point. Next slide. Although General Westmoreland initially envisioned the regiment as primarily a road clearing and convoy security force, successive Black Horse commanders utilized the 11th CAV's unique combined arms ground-air team to broaden the mission capabilities. The combination of aero scouts and gunships, teamed with heavily armed armored ground scouts, tanks, artillery, and engineers, proved to be the perfect formula for finding the bastards, piling on, and dominating the battlefield. Next slide. Each of the regiment's armored cavalry squadrons had ground recon scouts, tanks, infantry, artillery, and scout helicopters organic to their organization. The regimental commander typically task organized the general support units in support of those squadrons, the engineers, the medical, the intel. The air cav troop typically worked in general support of the regiment. And this team was able to do everything that he needed to accomplish the mission. Every vehicle, every aircraft had a radio. So the regimental commander, the squadron commander, all the way down to the platoon leader could get in touch with everybody and get the job done. Next slide. Finding the bastards and piling on was not just a motto. It was an especially effective tactic that was perfected by the 11th Armored Cavalry in Vietnam. Here's how it worked. Let's say an aero scout found a covey of the bastards. He would mark the spot with a smoke grenade, and the gunship that was accompanying him would make a couple of passes with rockets and miniguns. The aero scout would then send in a spot report and let higher headquarters know what was going on. All available Thunder Horse helicopters then came in to begin piling on. The 3 squadrons' artillery batteries started to pile on with their firepower. Black Horse 6 would contact the squadron commanders and say, okay, pile on. And the closest ground cavalry troop or tank company would start the pile on. And the pile on process would continue until the battle was won. All of these people worked for the regimental commander. He didn't have to call on the umpteenth combat aviation squadron or company to airlift people in. He didn't have to call on a truck company to get transportation. Everybody worked for him. It was a combined arms team. They worked together all the time. They all wore the same patch. They all wore the same crest. And no other brigade-size unit in Vietnam could do the same thing. Next slide, please. I hate to admit it, but the organization of the regiment in Vietnam was not perfect. I hate to admit that anything was not perfect, but there it is. Each armored cavalry squadron, platoon had a squad of 11 infantrymen, and the aero rifle platoon of about 20 infantrymen. That was not enough infantry riflemen to do the jobs that needed to be done in Vietnam. And so it became a matter of due course that from 68 on, the armored cavalry squadrons and light infantry companies and battalions from the divisions, 2 infantry divisions and the 1st Cav division would cross attach. And believe me, having been there and done that, an armored cavalry platoon with armored cavalry troop with 2 recon platoons, a tank platoon, and an infantry platoon was about as good as it got in Vietnam. It was a captain's dream command, and they could do pretty much any job that needed to be done. The other deficiency was the lack of logistical support. Above the squadron level, there was not a logistical battalion to support the regiment's efforts. And so they had to depend on general support units that frequently didn't have the same sense of priority or sense of urgency that Blackhorse 6 had. This deficiency was never resolved in Vietnam. It didn't get resolved until later in Germany in the 80s. Next slide. Every Blackhorse trooper was assigned to a tracked or wheeled vehicle or helicopter. When the order came to move out, you knew where your ride was. Nobody had to call that truck company or that aviation company to get from point A to point B. Nobody had to walk. And this proved to be a huge advantage considering that the regiment changed areas of operation so frequently. For example, when Blackhorse 6 was given just 48 hours to gather his unit, at that time spread across hundreds of acres of South Vietnamese jungle, and prepare to cross the border to attack into Cambodia in April of 1970. He had the radios to get the word out, the vehicles to move everybody, and the mobility to concentrate at the point of attack. And because of that, the Blackhorse led the ground assault into Cambodia on the 1st of May. Next slide, please. This slide gives you an overview of the wide range of equipment that gave the Blackhorse Regiment its mobility and lethality in Vietnam. Looking at this equipment, you have to remember an old cavalry axiom. Take care of your mount first, and then yourself. In the rain, in the mud, in the dust, in the heat, take care of your mount first, and then yourself. Next slide, please. This photo will give you an idea of what 3 armored cavalry troops looked like in 1966. Missing from the picture are the 17 tanks of the tank company, the 6 howitzers of the howitzer battery, and almost 100 tracked and wheeled vehicles of the headquarters troop. And that's just one squadron. There were 2 more. Next slide. This is a photo of 2nd Squadron the day before it crossed the border into Cambodia in 1970. Imagine if you were an enemy soldier and all of this stuff started to pile on your head. Next slide, please. This was an armored cavalry platoon in 1969. The regiment had 27 of the platoons that looked just like this. And just for those who are paying attention, the two Vietnamese children on the right side of the photo, while frequently present at the base camp, were not organic to the platoon. Next slide, please. The standard U.S. Army Scout vehicle in Vietnam at the time the regiment was training for deployment was the M113. It was an infantry carrier, had a crew of 2 and 9 infantrymen and 1 machine gun and no armored protection. That's shown on the left-hand side of the slide. On the right-hand side of the slide is the armored cavalry assault vehicle that was designed by members of the Blackhorse Regiment. Next slide, please. The resulting armored cavalry assault vehicle, ACAV, was a real game changer on the battlefields of Vietnam. 3 machine guns, probably 15,000 rounds of ammunition, all sorts of goodies, and everything that the troopers owned, because this was their home. There was a base camp that they almost never saw. They lived in these vehicles for months at a time. And despite the 15,000 rounds of ammunition on board, sometimes that wasn't enough. There were ambushes, such as on the 2nd of December of 66, the 21st of July of 67, the 13th of April of 69, and the 17th of April of 71, where the crews almost ran out of ammunition. And some of you listening to this webinar were part of those ambushes. Next slide, please. I recognize that this chart is a real eye test, and I won't ask you, there won't be any questions at the end of the briefing about this chart. But I ask you to look at what's inside the black box. A light infantry company frequently was up against an NVA battalion. And that light infantry company, U.S. light infantry company, had 5 machine guns. The NVA battalion had 10. And a Blackhorse recon troop had 90. That's firepower, and that made a huge difference. Next slide, please. When you're in an armored vehicle, you don't sneak up on anybody in the jungle. So you need the armor protection. You need the heavy firepower, and the ACAV and the tanks gave that to the troopers, and they repeatedly proved that this was a good organization and the right equipment. Next slide. Strong leadership at all levels was a hallmark of the regiment in Vietnam. As the only armored cavalry regiment in Vietnam, everybody who wore armor brass, officers, NCOs, wanted to have that Blackhorse patch on their right sleeve. 60% of the colonels who commanded the regiment in Vietnam went on to general officer rank. That's a damn good rate of success. This book tells their stories and the stories of countless junior officers and sergeants who went on to senior positions in the Army, in business, and in their communities. Next slide. This book is mostly about the 25,000 plus troopers who served in Vietnam and made the regiment unique, like Colonel Don Starry, who made the Army into the elite force it is today. Like Colonel Jimmy Leach, who made Armor Branch believe again. Like Major Fred Franks, who led 7th Corps to victory in the desert. Like Lieutenant Tom White, whose service in the regiment in Vietnam convinced him to make the Army a career, which ended up as him serving as the 18th Secretary of the Army. Like Regimental Command Sergeant Major Paul Squires, who took a dying trooper's words to heart. Don't let them forget. take care of our children. And he did just that by forming the Blackhorse Association. Like Captain John Poindexter, who almost single-handedly convinced the Army to present the Presidential Unit Citation to A Troop 40 years after the fact. And like Specialist 5's Ollie Pickrell and Alan Hathaway, who made the 11th Armored Cavalry Veterans of Vietnam and Cambodia into the strongest, most vibrant veterans organization in the United States. Next slide, please. And last but not least, the story also is about Combat the Dog. Combat the Dog was the longest serving Black Horse trooper in Vietnam. He was smuggled aboard the Sultan in Oakland in the fall of 1966, brought to Vietnam, and he served with the regiment until it stood down in 1971. His story is also in this book. Next slide. When the regiment arrived in Vietnam, they were told to wear the U.S. Army Vietnam patch. No combat trooper wants to wear the same patch that, say, the lifeguard at the Long Binh swimming pool wears. And so the regiment said, we need our own patch. And the Blackhorse patch is a result of that. It was approved in the spring of 1967. Next slide. Jerry Utterback was a Spec 4 in the Army in 1970. And he compares the Blackhorse patch to the 57 Chevy. And I can't think of a better comparison than that one. Next slide, please. There's a lot of esprit in this regiment, and it continues to today. We have a wreath-laying ceremony at the wall every Veterans Day and every Memorial Day. We have a wreath-laying at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier on the 2nd of February every year to commemorate the foundation of the 11th Cav. That is part of the esprit. Next slide. The regiment, troopers of the regiment, 3 troopers of the regiment were awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam, Yano and Wickham posthumously. Another 21 were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Next slide, please. This slide speaks for itself. It wasn't just the senior leaders who recognized the regiment was something special. Next slide, please. So what, you say? What accomplishments did the regiment make in its Vietnam service? The regiment's mobility made a difference on every battlefield. Armored protection and heavy firepower saved troopers' lives and allowed them to dominate the battle. Abe Abrams, an old horse cavalryman himself, knew what he had in the Black Horse and used it to perfection. And having the ability to find the bastards and pile on with assets that worked for him made a huge difference. Next slide. Some of the tactics, techniques, and procedures developed by Black Horse troopers are still in evidence in Iraq and Afghanistan today. The Black Horse troopers who developed the ACAV set the framework for today's armored fighting vehicles. And most importantly, the regiment demonstrated beyond any doubt that the combined arms team is the right answer on any battlefield. Next slide. Ladies and gentlemen, you may have gotten the impression over the last half hour or so that I'm biased towards the Black Horse Regiment. Guilty as charged. As a second-generation Black Horse trooper myself, I am proud to have served in the best damn regiment you will ever see. And if you read The Black Horse in Vietnam, you too will be convinced. Thank you, and Black Horse, sir.
Before I go to the audience questions, let me start with a couple of my own. First of all, on a personal note, as a fellow Blackhorse trooper, thanks for doing this book. It means a lot to all of us that have served in the 11th ACR. Speaking of research, you mentioned this was about 25 years of research to put this together. And it's very easy to brag on your unit, which you appropriately did. But at the same time, what struck me about the book was how much you wove into the book the impressions of North Vietnamese Army commanders and Viet Cong commanders. How did you get their impressions? How did you do that research to find out what the enemy was thinking? Because that kind of confirmed what the regiment was doing when your enemy comments on that.
Two primary sources on that. The first was interviews with prisoners of war that were recorded at the time in documents that I then reviewed at the National Record Center. Second was Neil Creighton, who commanded the 3rd Squadron in Vietnam when they were awarded the Presidential Unit Citation in 1968. He and his S3 went back to Vietnam a number of years later and met on those battlefields with the 9th VC Division commander and some of his subordinates. And so some of these insights and comments come from those interactions that General Creighton had with his former enemy.
Fascinating, fascinating. You mentioned briefly the French experience in Indochina in the 1950s. How prevalent was that in the regiment's thinking going into Vietnam?
I recall reading the Bernard Fall books. I recall the story of Group Mobile 100. I recall that as a young armor officer at the time, that's what you did to prepare to go to Vietnam because you knew you were going to go to Vietnam. And so everybody read those books and tried to analyze them. And fortunately, the Blackhorse leadership realized that there was a huge difference in equipment and in doctrine developed by the Blackhorse troopers that would make the difference, that the French had done it one way in Indochina and we were going to do it a different way, and that made all the difference in the world.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I looked at, as I was going through the book and the history of the Vietnam War, and especially the history of the regiment in Vietnam, the war to me kind of breaks down in 3 phases. The first being when the regiment arrived in mid-1966 through Tet of 68, phase 1. You may disagree with that. Phase 2, after 68, right up until the invasion of Cambodia in spring of 70. And then after Cambodia, the drawdown and redeployment of the regiment. Is that kind of how it breaks out for you?
Absolutely. And that should not in any way detract from the service of the Blackhorse troopers and commanders in each of those phases, because the first phase, the Blackhorse Regiment was establishing its credentials.
Right.
And in the second phase, as you say, from Tet of 68 through the Cambodia invasion, the regiment was not resting on its laurels, but expanding its mission base. And then, no surprise, when the regiment was stood down, the 2nd Squadron stayed in country because the residual U.S. Army force there around Saigon needed a unit just like 2nd Squadron to do the job that still needed to be done.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, each of those phases, different things came out of those phases in terms of development of doctrine and so forth. One part that struck me that really was kind of the perfect storm was the summer of 68 when Creighton Abrams takes over as MACV commander. and Colonel George Patton Jr. takes over the regiment almost simultaneously. And that really seemed to be the high watermark for find the bastards and pile on. You had a theater commander who understood how to use the regiment, and you had a commander, Blackhorse 6 Patton, who knew how to use the regiment. Is that kind of how you see it?
They had worked together in the same battalion in Kirchgoins in Germany, and so they knew each other very well. And Don Starry, the next commander, was also a company commander in that same battalion. So they knew each other. They knew what to expect of each other. And if Abrams said, go here and do that, he didn't have to say any more. He gave mission orders, and his subordinate as Blackhorse 6 understood without any further clarification, this is what we got to do. Absolutely.
Which leads to a good audience question here. A major part of U.S. Army doctrine today is what we call mission command, mission orders, not a lot of detail, focus on the commander's intent. That seemed to have started in those days. That's what we were describing. How does that pertain to today's Army?
Well, I liken the mission order or the op orders that were produced for Operations Junction City and Cedar Falls, and they were the typical one, and it was this thick, and it was in great detail. And then a year later, when it was Abrams in charge, he gave mission orders. He said, you know what I mean. And they did. They knew what he meant. And so they absolutely moved out and did things smartly. And I'm happy to hear that the Army is going back to that and doing things that way.
Well, I'm glad to hear that too. Two questions to wrap up here. One is, we talked about it earlier before coming on the air about aviation and how much the air cav troop and aviation assets contributed to the regiment, but they were not part of the original design of the regiment going into Vietnam. You mentioned a fixed wing. So how did things change there for aviation?
When the regiment came back from Germany in 1964, they had an aviation company that was primarily fixed wing aircraft, which was good for border surveillance in Germany. But by that time, by 65 and 66, when the regiment was getting ready to deploy, the 1st Cav and the 1st of the 9th Cav, an air cavalry squadron, had proven the value of air mobility, and the aviation company, 11th Cavalry Aviation Company, became the air cavalry troop. It was completely reorganized, and it was integral to virtually everything the regiment did in Vietnam.
Yeah, and it's become part of the other cavalry regiments since then.
Absolutely.
We have time for the last question, and I'm going to leave this one on kind of a humorous note. Towards the end of the regiment's time in Vietnam, 1972, as you mentioned, the 2nd Squadron was the remaining force as the rest of the regiment was redeploying. And towards the end of that time for the 2nd Squadron, there was the last commander of the squadron and ultimately the last commander of the regiment in Vietnam. Could you tell us who that was?
Bill Stokes was the 2nd Squadron commander when MACV told him that he was to stand his unit down. This was in late 1971, early 1972. And so over the course of January and February of 72, the squadron stood down, and those who had enough time in country already were sent home early, and those who didn't were sent out to other units within Vietnam. And then slowly but surely, everybody left until the color guard was left, and they were leaving on day X, and there was a residual of half a dozen Blackhorse troopers. And Bill Stokes said, okay, I'm leaving at the same time as the color guard. Who's going to be in charge? And they looked around, and the only officer that was still going to be there was the chaplain, Bill Carabinos. And so they turned to the chaplain and said, okay, you're in charge. And Bill Carabinos signed the last official document of the regiment in Vietnam. Blandon Carabinos, chaplain, commanding.
What a great story. Great story. Don, thanks very much.
Yes,
I really appreciate this. I think as I watched you put this book together, there are so many things that you couldn't get into the book. And my understanding is you're looking at a second edition coming out, and for the troopers that are online.
Yes, sir.
What's the purpose of that second book?
The second book is tentatively called Blackhorse Tales, and it's war stories. It's the troopers and the families' war stories. And it's all the stories that couldn't be put into 300 and some pages of volume 1. It's going to be fun to read. It's
Awesome.
fun writing it.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Good luck. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. If you want to get a copy of Don's book, please go to the AUSA website at ausa.org. We have a limited number of signed copies that Don has been gracious enough to autograph. And if you'd like one of those, please, again, go to the website or click here on the box that you see on the screen. Don, again, thank you very much for this. And on behalf of all the Blackhorse troopers here and watching online, we really appreciate what you've done with the book. For the rest of the audience here, I'd like to inform you of a couple of upcoming AUSA events as we go through the rest of the summer here and fall. Our next AUSA event is the Noon Report next week on 29 July. At noon, of course, and will feature the Army Surgeon General, Lieutenant General Scott Dingell. Our next Thought Leader webinar will be on the 4th of August, and that will feature L. Scott Lingamfelter, who is the author of Desert Redleg, Artillery Warfare in the First Gulf War. And then on 10 August, we'll have another Thought Leader seminar or webinar featuring Christian Brose, who is the author of The Kill Chain, Defending America in the Future of High-Tech Warfare. All of those ought to be great events, and you can sign up and register for all of those again at the AUSA website at ausa.org. Finally, we want to thank you for your membership. I'm assuming that everyone that is on this webinar is a member of AUSA, but if there's one or two out there who are not, please go to the AUSA website and join the association. We really can't do these events without your membership or represent our soldiers, their families, Army civilians, active Guard and Reserve without your membership. So please take time to join your Army Association. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Have a great Army Day and a great weekend.